The History of Subsumption by Endnotes, from Endnotes number 2, April 2010. The period. This is a period of cataclysmic crisis for capital, yet it is one in which the old projects of a programmatic working class are nowhere to be seen. This inescapable fact about contemporary class struggles compels us to trace the discontinuities between the past and the present. Understanding what distinguishes the current period can also help us to bury the dead of the failed revolutions of the 20th century, and put to rest any wandering spirits that still haunt communist theory. What is most at stake in its periodization is a question of where the past stops and the present begins. The identification of historical ruptures and discontinuities helps us to avoid the implicit metaphysics of a theory of class struggle in which every historical specificity is ultimately reduced to the eternal recurrence of the same. Yet periodizations can easily appear not as a recognition of real historical breaks, but as the arbitrary imposition of an abstract schema onto the dense fabric of history. For every line of rupture that is drawn, some remnant or holdover from another historical epoch may be located which appears to refute the periodization. Then, satisfied that such declarations of rupture cannot hold absolutely, we may feel justified in falling back onto the comfortable idea that nothing really changes, since here it is difference against which the skeptic can set herself. The historical same takes on the default certainty of common sense. Alternatively, perhaps the rupture is something to which we make a show of facing up, of recognizing the misery of retreat, and holding ourselves in the melancholy recognition of the passing of all that was good, meanwhile nursing a flame for its eventual return. Either way it is the same, whether as presence or lack. The past shrouds the specificity of the present. That a rupture with what some have called the old workers' movement, or with what Theorie Communiste, TC, called programmatism, occurred some 30 to 40 years ago confronts us as self-evident. But it is not enough to hold to the immediate self-evidence of historical rupture. The question is how to think rupture without either sliding into a dogmatic and abstract schematism, or an equally dogmatic appeal to immediate historical experience. This problem needs to be confronted theoretically, yet we should perhaps be wary of leaving the partial standpoint of the present, this side of the rupture, of rushing too quickly into the universalizing standpoint of a historical schema that would claim to abstract from particular standpoints. For us, the periodization of TC has been of central importance in facing up to the character of the capitalist class relation as it exists, not metaphysically, but historically. Their division of the history of capitalist society into phases of subsumption has proved useful in identifying real shifts in the character of capitalist class relation. And whilst it may often appear as precisely the kind of abstract schema which we should aim to avoid, TC's periodization is less that of the disinterested intellect, pushing each historical datum into its arbitrary taxonomic container, than a partisan declaration of historical break by communists who lived through it, compelling them to grapple with its rupture as a real problem. If then, in what follows, we criticize some core categories of TC's periodization, we do not do so in order to deny that the shifts which TC identify with these categories actually took place. For us, as for TC, the reproduction of the capitalist class relation is something which has changed over time, and the character of struggles has changed with it. We can hardly doubt that the proletarian movement passed through a programmatic phase, a phase which is no more, or that class struggles today no longer carry the horizon of a worker's world. The identification beyond this of exactly how this reproduction has changed is a task which cannot be accomplished merely through the deployment of different categories, or the exchange of one abstract schema for another. We need to remain attentive to the detail of the real movement of history, without shying away from the need to adequately theorize this movement. In the 1970s, in the midst of the historical break of the programmatic epoch of class struggle, the concept of subsumption emerged in Marxist discourse in the process of a general return to Marx, and in particular to the drafts of Capital. In a moment of rupture, the need to periodize the history of the capitalist class relation was evident, since the distinction between the formal and real subsumption of labor under capital, which was prominent in texts of Marx which are only then becoming known, seemed to identify something important about the historical deepening of capitalist relations of production. It proved an obvious starting point for such periodizations. Thus the concept of subsumption was employed not only in the periodization of TC, but also those of Jacques Camus and Antonio Negri, periodizations which often overlap significantly. We will here examine the concept of subsumption and its employment in these periodizations, first by excavating the philosophical roots of this concept and examining the systematic role it plays in Marx's work, and then by drawing out some problems in its employment as a historical category. The absurdity of subsumption. In its more general usage, subsumption is a fairly technical, philosophical, or logical term, referring to some ranging of some mass of particulars under a universal. As such, some basic logical or ontological relations may be described as relations of subsumption. Whales, or the concept whale, can be said to be subsumed under the category mammal. In German idealist philosophy, where it appears in the work of Kant, Schelling, and occasionally Hegel, the term is often used in a more dynamic sense to indicate a process whereby universal and particular are brought into relation. It is from this thread that the concept of subsumption makes its way into Marx's work. Kant considers the relation between the manifold and the categories of the understanding to be a relation of subsumption. This subsumption involves a process of abstraction through which the truth of the manifold is obtained. In terms of this process, the relation of subsumption here has some formal resemblance to that which Marx finds between particular use values and money as universal equivalent. In both cases, some particular is brought into relation with some otherwise external universal by being subsumed under it. The homology perhaps stretches further, concerned with the problem of how a pure concept of the understanding might be related to the appearances which it subsumes. Kant posits the transcendental schema as a third thing, uniting the two sides, just as Marx posits labor as a third thing, enabling comparison between two commodities. For Hegel, the process of subsumption and abstraction performed by the understanding in Kant is problematic, precisely because it takes an abstracted universal to be the truth of the particulars which it subsumes, and thereby transforms and obscures the very thing that is supposed to be thereby known. Quote, subsumption under the species alters what is immediate. We strip away what is sensory and lift out the universal. The alteration underway here we call abstracting. It seems absurd, if what we want is knowledge of external objects, to alter these external objects by a very abstractive activity upon them. The alteration consists in the fact that we separate off what is singular or external, and hold the truth of the thing to lie in what is universal rather than in what is singular or external. End quote from Hegel's Lectures on Logic. There is something absurd about a relation of subsumption. When the particular is subsumed under a universal, that universal presents itself as the truth of this particular. Indeed, it is as if this particular has become nothing other than an instantiation of the universal that subsumes it. Yet it seems that there must be something left over in this process, for the abstract universal is still just what it was at the start, while the particularity, which the particular had in opposition to the universal, has now been abstracted away entirely. Subsumption thus appears to involve a kind of domination or violence towards a particular. Hegel, it seems, wants to see the movement of the concept less as the abstracted process of the subsumption of particulars under universal, in which the universal ultimately is seized upon as the truth of a thing, than as the finding of a concrete universal present already in such particulars, necessarily mediating and mediated by its relation to these particulars. On Hegel's reading of Kant, it is externality of the manifold to the pure categories of the understanding, which means that the process of knowledge must be one of subsumption, since particulars must somehow be brought under the categories. That Hegel does not himself describe the movement of the concept in terms of subsumption may be taken as an example of his attempting to get beyond the epistemological divides characterizing the standpoint of reflection with which he frequently identifies Kant's philosophy, in which Lukács would go on to identify bourgeois thought per se. In the philosophy of right, however, Hegel describes a relation that involves a subsumption of the particular under the universal, just as external as that of the manifold under the categories in Kant's conception. Indeed, this relation is one of fairly straightforward political domination. This is the relation between the universality of the sovereign's decision and the particularity of civil society. In this case, rather than struggling to present the sovereign's decision as a concrete universal already immanent within particulars, Hegel presents it as an abstract, external universal to which particulars must be subordinated by the executive power, acting through the police and the judiciary. Quote, the execution and application of the sovereign's decisions, and in general, the continued implementation and upholding of earlier decisions, are distinct from the decisions themselves. This task of subsumption in general belongs to the executive power, which also includes the powers of the judiciary and the police. These have more immediate reference to the particular affairs of civil society, and they assert the universal interest within these particular ends. End quote from Hegel's Philosophy of Right. We might infer from his usage of a category, which he seems to associate with a problematic, external relation, that Hegel is being critical of the relation between sovereign and civil society. But it is far from clear that this is the case. Indeed, for the young Marx, as for many others, the philosophy of right represents the most conservative moment in Hegel's works, where political domination is given the seal of approval of a speculative philosophy. In contribution to the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, Marx criticizes Hegel's usage of the concept of subsumption here as the imputation of a philosophical category onto objective social processes. Quote, the sole philosophical statement Hegel makes about the executive is that he subsumes the individual and the particular under the general, etc. Hegel contents himself with this. On the one hand, the category of subsumption of the particular, etc. This has to be actualized. Then he takes any one of the empirical forms of existence of the Prussian or modern state, just as it is, anything which actualizes this category among others, even though this category does not express a specific character. Applied mathematics is also subsumption. Hegel does not ask, is this the rational, the adequate mode of subsumption? He only takes the one category and contents himself with finding a corresponding existent for it. Hegel gives a political body to his logic. He does not give the logic of the body politic. End quote from Marx's contribution to the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right. The irony here is that it is just such a usage of this category that Marx himself goes on to develop. From the 1861-1863 draft of Capital onwards, subsumption for Marx is a subsumption of the particularities of the labor process under the abstract universality of the valorization process of capital. The abstract category, it seems, really does find itself a body. Marx's critique of German idealist philosophy is thus paralleled in his critique of capital. However, now the error is not on the part of the speculative philosopher, for it resides rather in capitalist social relations themselves. The abstract universal value, whose existence is posited by the exchange abstraction, acquires a real existence vis-a-vis particular concrete labors, which are subsumed under it. The real existence of abstractions, which acquire the ability to subsume the concrete world of production under them, and posit themselves as the truth of this world, is for Marx nothing other than a perverted, enchanted, ontologically inverted reality. The absurdity and violence which Hegel perceives in the relation of subsumption applies not only to Hegel's system itself, but also to the actual social relations of capitalist society. The formality and the reality of subsumption. For Marx, the production process of capital can only occur on the basis of the subsumption of the labor process under capital's valorization process. In order to accumulate surplus value, and thus to valorize itself as capital, capital must subordinate the labor process to its own ends and, in so doing, transform it. The German idealist roots of the concept of subsumption are apparent here in the way that Marx conceptualizes this process. The particular is subordinated to the abstract universal, and thereby transformed or obscured. The distinction between formal and real subsumption identifies the implicit distinction between two moments that we have here. Capital must subordinate the labor process to its valorization process. It must formally subsume it, if it is to reshape that process in its own image, or really subsume it. In results of the direct production process, hereafter just results, Marx associates the categories of formal and real subsumption very closely with those of absolute and relative surplus value. We can identify more specifically what distinguishes real from formal subsumption in terms of these two categories. Formal subsumption remains merely formal precisely in the sense that it does not involve capital's transformation of a given labor process, but simply its taking hold of it. Capital can extract surplus value from the labor process simply as it is given, and its given productivity of labor. but it can do so only insofar as it can extend the social working day beyond what must be expended on necessary labor. It is for this reason that formal subsumption alone could only ever yield absolute surplus value. The absoluteness of absolute surplus value lies in the fact that its extraction involves an absolute extension of the social working day. It is a simple quantity in excess of what is socially necessary for workers to reproduce themselves. The subsumption of the labor process under the valorization process of capital becomes real insofar as capital does not merely rest with the labor process as it is given, but steps beyond formal possession of that process to transform it in its own image. Through technological innovations and the alterations of the labor process, capital is able to increase the productivity of labor. Since higher productivity means that less labor is required to produce the goods which the working class consumes, capital thereby reduces the portion of the social working day devoted to necessary labor, and concomitantly increases that devoted to surplus labor. The relativity of the relative surplus value lies in the fact that the surplus part of the social working day may thus be surplus relative to a decreasing necessary part, meaning that capital may valorize itself on the basis of a given length of the social working day, or even one that is diminished in absolute length. The production of relative surplus value and the real subsumption through which this takes place are driven by the competition between capitals. Individual capitalists are spurred on to seize the initiative by the fact that, while the value of commodities is determined by the socially necessary labor time for their production, if they introduce technological innovations which increase the productivity of labor, they will be able to sell commodities at a price above their individual value. Despite their usage by Marx in close association with systematic categories like absolute and relative surplus value, and their abstract philosophical provenance, there are at least two senses here in which we may consider the categories of formal and real subsumption to have a historical significance. Firstly, as capital's simple taking hold of the labor process, the formal subsumption of labor under capital can be understood as a transition to the capitalist mode of production. It is the subsumption under capital of a mode of labor already developed before the emergence of the capital relation. Marx describes the transformation of slave, peasant, guild, and handicraft forms of production into capitalist production, as producers associated with these forms are transformed into wage laborers, as a process of formal subsumption. It is only on the basis of this formal subsumption that real subsumption can proceed historically. Formal subsumption of labor under capital is both a logical, systematic, and a historical prerequisite for real subsumption. Secondly, real subsumption has a historical directionality, for it entails a constant process of revolutionizing the labor process through material and technological transformations, which increase the productivity of labor. From these secular increases in productivity follow broader transformations in the character of society as a whole, and the relations of production between workers and capitalists in particular. Real subsumption as a modification of the labor process along specifically capitalist lines is exemplified in the historical development of the productive powers of social labor as the productive powers of capital. This occurs through cooperation, the division of labor and manufacture, machinery and large-scale industry, all of which are discussed by Marx under the heading of the production of relative surplus value in Volume 1 of Capital. It is for these reasons that the categories of formal and real subsumption may seem appropriate for employment in the periodization of capitalist history. There is undoubtedly a certain plausibility to schematizing the history of capitalism broadly in terms of categories which identify an initial extensive taking hold of the labor process by capital, and a subsequent intensive development of that process under a dynamic capitalist development. For at an abstract level, it is absolutely fundamental to capital that these two moments must occur. Such an employment of these categories also has the apparent virtue of staying close to the core of Marx's systematic grasp of capitalist value relations, while grasping key moments of their historical existence. They seem to suggest the possibility of a unifying system and history. It is undoubtedly for some, if not all, of these reasons that T.C., Kamat, and Negri all formulated periodizations of capitalist history oriented around the concept of subsumption. The history of subsumption. In the course of an interpretation of the results, Jacques Kamat sketches an abstract periodization of capitalist history on the basis of the formal and real subsumption of labor under capital. For Kamat, what distinguishes that period of real subsumption from that of formal subsumption is that, with real subsumption, the means of production become means of extracting surplus labor. The essential element in this process is fixed capital. The period of real subsumption is characterized by the application of science in the immediate process of production, such that, quote, the means of production become no more than leeches drawing off as large a quantum of living labor as they can, end quote, from Marx's Results of the Direct Production Process. Thus, for Kamat, the real subsumption of labor under capital is characterized by an inversion. Real subsumption is the period in which workers become exploited by the means of production themselves. Yet Kamat goes further, speaking of a total subsumption of labor under capital, in which capital exercises an absolute domination over society. Indeed, it tends to become society. This period is characterized by the becoming of capital as totality, in which capital is erected as a material community, standing in the place of a true human community. It is as if capital has come to envelop the social being of humanity in its entirety, as its subsumption has been so successful that capital can now pass itself off not only as a truth of the labor process, but of human society as a whole. It is easy to see in this theory of total subsumption and material community the logic which would propel Kamat towards a politics involving little more than the abstract assertion of some true human community against a monolithic capitalist totality, and of the need to leave this world. Kamat is not the only theorist to describe the latest epoch in capitalist development in terms of a certain kind of completion of capitalist assumption. Indeed, this is a common theme across divergent Marxist traditions. Though he does not use the term subsumption itself, in Jameson's Marxist recasting the concept of postmodernity, those very pre-capitalist enclaves, nature and the unconscious, which offered extraterritorial and Archimedean footholds for critical effectivity, are colonized, and the individual submerged in the ubiquitous logic of a capitalist culture. As with Kamat, it is as if the very success of a kind of capitalist assumption means that we can no longer grasp that which subsumes as an external imposition. In the form of the social factory thesis, Tronti presents a conception of the historical epoch as that of a kind of completed subsumption, but, with the customary sanguinity of operaismo, this is understood as a result of the essential creativity and resistance of the working class. In the moment of its total victory, where social capital has come to dominate the whole of society, capital is forced by the resistance of the working class to extend its domination beyond the factory walls to the whole of society. Echoing Tronti's social factory thesis, Negri described a total subsumption of society in the period beginning after 1968. This, argues Negri, marks the end of the centrality of the factory working class as a site of the emergence of revolutionary subjectivity. In this period, the capitalist process of production has attained such a high level of development as to encompass even the smallest fraction of social production. Capitalist production is no longer limited to the sphere of industrial production, but rather is diffuse and occurs across society. The contemporary mode of production is this subsumption. Although he frequently employs the categories of subsumption historically, Negri warns against constituting a natural history of the progressive subsumption of labor under capital and illustrating the form of value in the process of perfecting its mechanisms. Apparently attempting an autonomous Copernican turn within the periodization of subsumption, Negri thus describes specific class consumptions and models of contestation corresponding to each period of capitalist history. To the first phase of large-scale industry corresponds the appropriative phase of the proletarian movement, 1848 to 1914, in the professional or craft worker. To the second phase corresponds the alternative phase of the revolutionary movement, 1917 to 1968, and a class consumption based on the hegemony of the mass worker. And finally, to the current phase of capitalist development corresponds the socialized worker, appareil social, in the constituent model of proletarian self-valorization. Similarly, for TC, the periods of a history of subsumption identify not only the history of capital itself, but also specific cycles of struggle. Rather than the result of the Copernican turn to the positivity of the working class, however, for TC, this is because the categories of subsumption periodize the development of the relation between capital and the proletariat. TC follow Marx in drawing a relation between the categories of formal and real subsumption and those of absolute and relative surplus value. The key to TC's historical periodization lies in our interpretation of the systematic interrelation of categories. For TC, absolute and relative surplus value are conceptual determinations of capital, and formal and real subsumption are historical configurations of capital. Thus, while the formal subsumption of labor into capital proceeds on the basis of absolute surplus value, relative surplus value is both the founding principle and the dynamic of real subsumption. It is a principle which gives structure to, and then overturns, the first phase of real subsumption. Thus, relative surplus value is both a principle which unifies the two phases into which TC divide real subsumption, and that in terms of which it is possible to explain the transformation of real subsumption and its consequent division into phases. Quote, real subsumption has a history because it has a dynamic principle which forms it, makes it evolve, poses certain forms of the process of valorization or circulation as fetters and transforms them. End quote. From Theorie Communiste, Response to Offenbaum. TC posits a conceptual distinction between formal subsumption and real subsumption in terms of their extension. Formal subsumption affects only the immediate labor process, while real subsumption extends beyond the sphere of production to society as a whole, just as it does for Kamat and Negri. Thus, formal subsumption for TC corresponds to the configuration of capital based on the extraction of absolute surplus value, which is, by definition, limited to the immediate labor process. Capital takes over an existing labor process and intensifies it or lengthens the working day. The relation between real subsumption and relative surplus value is more complex, however. The increased productivity of labor resulting from transformations in the labor process can only increase relative surplus value insofar as this increased productivity lowers the value of commodities entering into the consumption of the working class. As such, real subsumption brings into play the reproduction of the proletariat, insofar as the wage becomes a variable quantity affected by the productivity of labor in industries producing wage goods. Real subsumption thus establishes the systematic and historical interconnections between the reproduction of the proletariat and the reproduction of capital. The extraction of relative surplus value affects all social combinations from the labor process to the political forms of workers' representation, passing through the integration of the reproduction of labor power in the cycle of capital, the role of the credit system, the constitution of a specifically capitalist world market, the subordination of science. Real subsumption is a transformation of society and not the labor process alone. The reproduction of the proletariat and the reproduction of capital become increasingly interlocked through real subsumption. It integrates the two circuits of the reproduction of labor power and the reproduction of capital as a self-reproduction and self-presupposition of the class relation itself. Thus, TC defined the real subsumption of labor under capital as capital becoming capitalist society, i.e. presupposing itself in its evolution and the creation of its organs. The criterion for the predominance of real subsumption, itself defined in terms of transformations of the labor process, must thus be sought outside the labor process, in the modalities, both political and socio-economic, of reproduction of labor power which accompany and are to some extent determined by the material transformations accomplished in the labor process. Examples of such modalities include social welfare systems, the invention of the category of unemployment, and the importance of trade unionism. These all help to ensure and confirm that labor power no longer has any possible ways out of its exchange with capital in the framework of the specifically capitalist labor process. It is these modalities of the reproduction of labor power which are fundamentally altered by the restructuring of the capitalist class relation which begins in the 1970s, and it is on this basis that TC argues that the broad phases of transformation at the level of the modalities of the general reproduction of the proletariat should serve as criteria for the periodization of real subsumption. TC's dating corresponds closely to that proposed by Negri. For TC, the phase of formal subsumption of labor under capital, up to the turn of the century or around the First World War, is characterized by the positive self-relation of the proletariat as pole of the class relation. In this period, the proletariat affirms itself as a class of productive labor against capital, which is an external constraint from which the proletariat must liberate itself. Proletarian self-affirmation can never beget proletarian self-negation and the negation of capital. Thus, in this phase, the communist revolution was impossible, or rather, the communist revolution as affirmation and liberation of labor carried within it the counter-revolution. The period of transition to communism proved to be nothing other than the renewal of capitalist accumulation, and was determined as such by the very configuration of the class relation in the counter-revolutionary movement that this configuration of the class relation produced. In the subsequent first phase of real subsumption of labor under capital from the First World War to the end of the 1960s, the relation between capital and proletariat becomes increasingly internal, such that the autonomous affirmation of the class enters into contradiction with its empowerment within capitalism, in that this is more and more the self-movement of the reproduction of capital itself. In the transition from formal to real subsumption, the class relation undergoes a qualitative transformation, in that the reproduction of the proletariat is now increasingly integrated with the circuit of reproduction of capital via certain mediations. These include the institutional forms of the workers' movement, trade unions, collective bargaining, and productivity deals, Keynesianism and the welfare state, the geopolitical division of the world market into discrete national areas of accumulation, and, on a higher level, zones of accumulation, east and west. Formal subsumption and the first phase of real subsumption of labor under capital are characterized by the programmatic self-affirmation of the proletariat. The first phase of real subsumption is increasingly revealed, however, to be the decomposition of this programmatic proletarian self-affirmation, even as the proletariat is increasingly empowered within the class relation. With the capitalist restructuring after 1968 and 1973, which must be understood as a restructuring of the relation between capital and proletariat, all these mediations are at least tendentially dissolved. The new period, the second phase of real subsumption of labor under capital, is then characterized by a more immediately internal relation between capital and the proletariat, and the contradiction between them is thus immediately at the level of their reproduction as classes. Proletarian programmatic self-affirmation is now dead and buried, yet class antagonism is as sharp as ever. The only revolutionary perspective afforded the current cycle of struggles is that of the self-negation of the proletariat and the concomitant abolition of capital through the communization of relations between individuals. Critique of the history of subsumption. The periodizations proposed by Kamat, Negri, and TC apply beyond the immediate process of production. Kamat and Negri hold real subsumption to be true of society, and for TC, formal and real subsumption can be said to characterize a fundamental relation between capital and labor in a sense that is not reducible to the immediate production process. There may appear to be some ground in Marx for pursuing such a usage of these categories, since Marx refers to transformations in the actual social relation between capitalist and worker, beyond production, that arise with, or as a result of, real subsumption. Quote, with the real subsumption of labor under capital, a complete revolution takes place in the mode of production itself, in the productivity of labor, and in the relation within production between the capitalist and the worker, as also in the social relation between them. End a quote from Marx's Economic Manuscript of 1861 to 1863. It is evident that, with the constant revolutionizing of production that occurs in real subsumption, the world beyond the immediate process of production is itself dramatically transformed. The important qualification here, however, is that these transformations occur with, or as a result of, the real subsumption of the labor process under the valorization process. They do not necessarily constitute an aspect of real subsumption itself, nor do they define it, and indeed, they may actually be considered mere effects of real subsumption. Though massively significant changes to society as a whole, and to the relation between capitalist and worker, may result from the real subsumption of the labor process under capital, it does not follow that these changes can themselves be theorized in the terms of the concept of subsumption. As we have seen, subsumption has a distinct ontological character. The violence that is committed by a subsuming category lies in the fact that it is able to pass itself off as a truth of the very thing which it subsumes, to transform that particular into the mere instantiation of a universal. When the labor process is subsumed under the valorization process, it becomes capital's own immediate process of production. As Kamat argues, quote, subsumption means rather more than just submission. Subsumerian really means to include in something, to subordinate, to implicate. So it seems that Marx wanted to indicate that capital makes its own substance out of labor, that capital incorporates labor inside itself and makes it into capital. End quote from Kamat's Capital and Community. The labor process in both real and formal subsumption is the immediate production process of capital. Nothing comparable can be said of anything beyond the production process, for it is only production which capital directly claims as its own. While it is true that the valorization process of capital in its entirety is a unity of the processes of production and circulation, and whilst capital brings about transformations of the world beyond its own immediate production process, these transformations by definition cannot be grasped in the same terms as those which occur within that process under real subsumption. Nothing external to the immediate production process actually becomes capital, nor, strictly speaking, is subsumed under capital. Even if we were to accept the idea of an extension of real subsumption beyond the immediate process of production, the viability of subsumption as a category for periodization is doubtful, since formal subsumption is a logical prerequisite of real subsumption as well as a historical one. It characterizes not just one historical epoch, but the entirety of capitalist history. Furthermore, according to Marx, though formal subsumption must precede real subsumption in one branch can also be the basis for further formal subsumption in other areas. If the categories of subsumption are applicable to history at all, this can therefore only be in a non-linear fashion. They cannot apply simplistically or unidirectionally to the historical development of the class relation. Whilst we could plausibly say that at the total level, at any given stage in the development of this relation, the labor process is more or less really subsumed under the valorization process than at any other given moment, this can only be a weak and ambiguous claim, and can hardly form a systematic basis for any account of actual historical developments. The work of some theorists in the area of value form theory or systematic dialectic, such as Patrick Murray and Chris Arthur, put such periodization further in doubt. For Arthur, though formal subsumption may well precede real subsumption temporally, in the case of any given capital, real subsumption is inherent to the concept of capital from the outset. If real subsumption is thus something always implicit, which is only actualized in the course of capitalist history, this would further undermine any attempt to demarcate a specific period of real subsumption. Murray argues that the terms formal subsumption and real subsumption refer first to the concept of subsumption, and only secondarily, if at all, to historical stages. According to Murray, Marx considers the possibility of a distinct historical stage of merely formal subsumption, but finds no evidence of one. If subsumption cannot rigorously apply to historical periods per se, nor to anything beyond the immediate process of production, we must conclude that it is not ultimately a viable category for a periodization of capitalist history. We need other categories with which to grasp the development of the totality of the capitalist class relation, and in a manner which is not limited to the production process alone. Yet what is at stake is a great deal more than having the correct set of categories. That so many periodizations, regardless of their categorical framework, converge on the same dates, recognizing in particular that some fundamental rupture took place between the late 60s and mid-70s, is a strong indication that there is more to periodization than some aphasiac proliferation of terms, periods, and arbitrary constellations of data. These periodizations, and that of TC in particular, are compelling because they tell us something plausible about the character of the class relation as it exists today. But categorical frameworks are of course not neutral, and a problematic core category will have implications for the rest of the theory. TC's phase of formal subsumption has much in common with the regulation school concept of a period of extensive accumulation, and indeed both locate a transition from these respective phases around the First World War. It is only at this point that real subsumption begins for TC, because it is at this point that the increasing productivity of labor begins to cheapen consumer goods, and thus to mutually implicate the reproduction of working class and capital. Similarly, for the regulationists, prior to the proper development of mass consumption, accumulation must be primarily extensive. In both cases, a period of primarily absolute surplus value extraction is perceived as existing prior to the full development of the specifically capitalist mode of production, and a shift of focus of relative surplus value. But there are significant problems with this notion of a period of extensive accumulation. as Brenner and Glick have forcefully argued. Capitalist production tends to commoditize and cheapen consumer goods from the outset, and agriculture is not something that is capitalized late, except perhaps in particular cases such as that of France, whose rural landscape remained dominated through the 19th century by small peasant owner-producers. It is tempting to surmise the apparent fit of the French case to the concept of a historical phase of formal subsumption is the real basis for this aspect of TC's periodization. But if this is the case, the viability of at least this aspect of the periodization for the history of the capitalist-class relation per se looks severely in doubt. Yet our criticism of TC's history of subsumption need not lead us to reject everything in TC's theory en masse. We will need, of course, to think through the implications for this theory of doing away with the historical concept of subsumption, but it is in the concept of programmatism and the analysis of the subsequent period up to the present that the heart of the theory lies. The concept of programmatism identifies important dimensions of class struggle as it was throughout much of the 20th century, and thus helps us to understand the way in which the world has changed. Perhaps because of this recognition of rupture, TC had not shied away from confronting with clear eyes the character of struggles as they happen today, or from continuing to pose the fundamental question of communist theory. How can the proletariat, acting strictly as a class of this mode of production, in its contradiction with capital within the capitalist mode of production, abolish classes, and therefore itself, that is to say, produce communism?